In late 2025, the United States government did something it had never done before. It shut down for 41 straight days, the longest in its history. This sent shockwaves across the entire country. So today, we're going to unpack exactly how this standoff happened, what the real cost was for millions of people, and how the deadlock was finally broken. 41 days. Just let that number sink in for a second. For over a month, the very gears of the federal government were just frozen. And that created a crisis that touched pretty much everyone. It's a question that sounds like it's from a disaster movie, right? But it became a really harsh reality for so many. So what actually happens when the funding dries up and the doors slam shut? Let's get into it. Okay, to really understand the chaos, you first have to understand the cause. And it all starts with a fundamental political breakdown in Washington. So here's the key thing to get. A government shutdown isn't really a choice, it's a legal requirement. When Congress can't agree on a budget, this law, the Anti-Deficiency Act, kicks in. And it basically says if there's no money approved, you can't spend it, period. So agencies have to shut down everything that isn't considered accepted. The absolute essentials needed to protect life or property. And this right here, this was the core disagreement that led to that 41-day stalemate. On one side, you had Democrats saying, look, any bill to reopen the government has to deal with these expiring health insurance tax credits. On the other side, Republicans were just as firm. Nope, reopen the government first, then we can talk about other policies. They were starting from two completely different places, and for weeks, neither side was willing to budge an inch. And while the politicians were debating in Washington, the real-world consequences were just piling up. This wasn't some abstract political fight. It had a massive, profound human cost. And that's where we're going next. First, you have at least 670,000 federal employees who were furloughed. That means they were sent home, told not to come to work, and they weren't getting paid. Just like that, their lives, their bills, their futures, all thrown into total uncertainty overnight. But then you've got the other side of this coin, the so-called accepted employees. We're talking about another 730,000 people. Think air traffic controllers, TSA agents, some law enforcement, folks in critical jobs. They were legally required to show up to work every single day, but with absolutely no guarantee of when or even if they'd get a paycheck. Now, get this. If the shutdown had dragged on just a little longer through the start of December, the total amount of missing wages would have been an estimated $21 billion. That's staggering. That's not just money people used to pay their mortgages and buy groceries. It's money that wasn't flowing into local economies all across the country. And this quote from Micah Nemir Walsh, a union vice president, it just perfectly captures the feeling on the ground. For these federal workers, this wasn't just a political game. It felt personal. It felt like the culmination of a really chaotic year where their jobs and their livelihoods were constantly being put on the line. And of course, that kind of financial strain creates a huge mental toll. Now, we don't have the hard data on this specific shutdown just yet, but look at this. A study after the 2018 shutdown found that nearly 3/4 of federal workers felt high levels of anxiety and stress. It's not hard to imagine it was just as bad, if not worse, this time around. This was the billion-dollar question, right? The one hanging over every single furloughed worker's head. I mean, in past shutdowns, they'd always gotten back pay, eventually. But this time, the signals coming out of Washington were deeply, deeply worrying. Okay. Now, this slide is fascinating and honestly a little terrifying. Look at the change in the official paperwork. The first furlough notices, sent out on October 1st, had this specific language assuring workers they'd be paid thanks to a 2019 law. But when the shutdown dragged into its second month, the new notices, sent on October 31st, that language was gone, just removed. Can you even imagine the fear and panic that must have created? And the shutdown didn't just hurt federal employees. Oh no. The impact rippled outwards, big time, disrupting entire industries and services all across the economy. Yeah, this really shows what a complete nightmare it was for federal contractors. It wasn't as simple as just stopping. They got these official stop work orders. Then they had to tell all their own subcontractors to stop, and then began this incredibly complex, expensive process of tracking every single cost. Idle workers, ramp down expenses, all in the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could get reimbursed for it later through a formal claim. What a mess. And the rest of the country felt it directly too.
Air traffic controllers were working without pay, which led to staffing shortages and major airport delays. Tens of millions of people who rely on SNAP benefits for food were suddenly facing the loss of that assistance. The pay for 1.3 million active duty military members was in jeopardy. And of course, everyday things like visiting a national park or going to a government office, forget about it. Everything was closed.
So, after 41 days of chaos and so much uncertainty, how did the gridlock finally break? Let's take a look at the final days of this historic standoff. All right, on day 41, there was finally a breakthrough. A small group of 8 Democratic senators crossed the aisle to join with Republicans, and they passed a funding package, hitting that crucial 60-vote mark. From there, the bill went to the House, which was actually called back from a long recess just to vote on it. And that set the stage for the president to sign it and finally end the crisis. So what was actually in the final deal? Well, it was a classic compromise. It funded the government with a temporary measure to keep things running until early 2026. Most importantly, it guaranteed back pay for all federal employees and even reversed over 4,000 layoffs that had been issued during the shutdown. And in return for those crucial Democratic votes, Republicans promised to hold a separate vote on those healthcare tax credits down the road. And here it is, the answer to that critical question of back pay. The deal reactivated that 2019 law, the Government Employee Fair Treatment Act, which says retroactive pay has to be issued at the earliest date possible, not just on the next scheduled payday. For hundreds of thousands of families, this was a massive, massive relief. So the government's back open and the paychecks are on the way, but the story doesn't really end there, does it? After 41 days of financial hardship, incredible stress, and public disruption, you really have to ask, what's the long-term cost of all this? What trust in our institutions was lost along the way? And maybe more importantly, how long is it going to take to rebuild it?